Think about kings for more than 5 seconds, and the whole idea becomes strangely absurd. At some point, thousands of humans looked at another human and somehow agreed, that guy gets the palace. He gets the soldiers, the taxes, the finest food, the enormous chair, and perhaps even a special connection to the gods. Everyone else? They were expected to bow. But here's the strange part. For most of human existence, there were no kings at all. Our ancestors lived in small communities where an arrogant leader could be mocked, ignored, challenged, or simply abandoned. So how did humanity go from, "You can't tell me what to do," to, "Your Majesty"? The answer isn't the invention of the crown. It's the invention of obedience. Before humans had kings, palaces, or tax collectors, there was a serious problem for anyone dreaming of absolute power. People could simply walk away. For most of human history, our ancestors lived in relatively small, mobile communities. If one hunter became too arrogant, demanded the best food, or started behaving as though everyone else existed to serve him, the group had options. They could ignore him, mock him, refuse to cooperate, or pack their belongings and leave. Mobility was political power. You cannot rule people permanently when they can disappear into the forest tomorrow. And you certainly cannot collect taxes from people you cannot find. Anthropologists have documented what are sometimes called leveling mechanisms in relatively egalitarian societies: ridicule, gossip, expectations of sharing, collective decision-making, and alliances against individuals who become too domineering. A talented hunter might earn enormous prestige, but prestige was not automatically authority. Killing the largest animal did not suddenly give you ownership of everyone else's food, children, land, and future. Of course, prehistoric societies were not perfectly equal. Age, fighting ability, family connections, ritual knowledge, personality, and access to resources could all create differences in influence. Archaeology also suggests prehistoric communities experimented with many different political arrangements. But becoming influential was one thing. Becoming a king was something entirely different. A king needs power that survives disagreement. Power tied to land, food, followers, institution, and eventually inheritance. For that to happen, humans first had to lose one of their oldest freedoms, the ability to simply leave. And that began when we stopped wandering and started building permanent homes. Then humans began doing something that quietly changed the rules of power. We stopped moving. Long before the first recognizable kings appeared, some communities began returning to the same rich fishing grounds, harvesting wild cereals, building stronger shelters, and eventually domesticating plants and animals. For the first time, more of a family's future became attached to one place. And that changed everything. Imagine you are a hunter-gatherer, and someone in your group becomes unbearable. You can leave. But now imagine you're a farmer. Your barley is here. Your livestock is here. Your house is here. Your stored food is here. Even your ancestors may be buried here. Walking away no longer means carrying your possessions somewhere else. It means abandoning your wealth, labor, history, and future. And something else had appeared. Surplus. A successful hunter could become famous for bringing down an enormous animal, but his reputation was difficult to store. Grain was different. Grain could sit inside a granary. A herd could grow. A field could be inherited. A valuable house could remain after its owner died. Wealth had become physical, and anything physical could be stored, guarded, inherited, or controlled. This didn't instantly create kings. Many settled and farming societies resisted permanent hierarchy in different ways. But the political environment had fundamentally changed. Humans had spent countless generations developing ways to restrain overly ambitious individuals. Then, we built villages. We accumulated property. We became harder to move. And suddenly, ambition had an address. The next step was even more dangerous. Because once wealth could accumulate, some families inevitably began accumulating more of it than others. Farming did not immediately create kings, but it created something kings would eventually become very interested in. Things that could be counted: grain, livestock, land, labor. And once wealth could be counted, it could also be divided, inherited, borrowed, guarded, and taken. Imagine two families living in the same early village. One has slightly better land. Maybe the soil holds water longer. Maybe they have more relatives helping during harvest. Or maybe they simply get lucky for several seasons. Their granary fills. Then their neighbors have a terrible harvest. Now the wealthy family can lend them grain. In return, they might receive labor, livestock, marriage connections, or future obligations. Nobody has invented feudalism yet, but the ingredients are beginning to look suspicious. Over generations, small advantages can become larger differences. Archaeologists sometimes see this growing inequality through bigger houses, larger storage facilities, richer graves, imported luxury materials, and eventually monumental buildings. But surplus did something even more important. If a community produced enough food, not everyone needed to spend every day producing it. Some people could become craftsmen, traders, ritual specialists, administrators, even full-time warriors. And as villages grew into larger settlements, somebody had to coordinate increasingly complicated problems. Who maintains the irrigation channels? Who protects the grain? Who settles disputes? Who organizes hundreds of workers? A group of 30 people might solve problems around a fire. A settlement of thousands cannot. Humans still hadn't invented kings, but they were building something a king desperately needed. Institution. And then another force arrived that could transform temporary leadership into permanent authority. War. Permanent settlements created wealth, but they also created something hunter-gatherers had faced on a much smaller scale, something worth stealing. A village could not simply disappear when enemies approached. Its grain stores were here. Its livestock were here. Its fertile fields were here. Its trade routes, homes, and water sources were here. And all of them could become targets. When danger arrived, endless debate became expensive. Someone had to organize defenses. Someone had to decide where warriors stood when they attacked and how resources were distributed. A successful war leader could suddenly become extremely valuable, and victory brought more than safety. It could bring captured livestock, land, trade goods, prestige, and, most importantly, followers. Imagine one leader wins a battle. People trust him during the next crisis. He wins again. Now warriors are personally loyal to him. Captured wealth allows him to reward supporters. Those supporters help protect his wealth and strengthen his position. A feedback loop begins. Food supports followers. Followers protect food. Victory creates prestige. Prestige creates alliances. And alliances create marriages. Marriages create heirs. Soon, the leader's son isn't inheriting only a house or a herd. He may inherit relationships, resources, obligations, and increasingly, status itself. Power was becoming sticky. Of course, warfare alone did not automatically create kings. Many societies fought wars without producing hereditary monarchies. But combine warfare with stored wealth, permanent settlements, growing inequality, and institutions, and temporary leadership becomes much easier to make permanent. Humanity had created surplus. It had created warriors. It had created administrators. Now it was approaching the next enormous step, a city where power itself could become organized. And one of the clearest places to see that transformation was ancient Mesopotamia. By around 3200 BCE, something extraordinary was happening in southern Mesopotamia. A settlement called Uruk had grown into something humans had rarely experienced before, a true urban society. Thousands of people lived together. There were monumental buildings, specialized craftsmen, long-distance trade networks, religious institutions, and administrators responsible for managing resources. And suddenly, memory wasn't enough. You couldn't simply remember which family owed 3 baskets of barley or how much grain hundreds of workers had received. So humans began writing things down. And some of the earliest surviving tablets from Uruk aren't glorious stories about heroic kings. They're essentially paperwork, grain, animals, labor, rations, officials. Civilization developed bureaucracy before it perfected royal propaganda. But this is where we need to be careful. Administrators and monumental buildings don't automatically prove that Uruk already had kings, exactly as later societies understood them. Political authority was still evolving. A few centuries later, however, the evidence becomes much harder to ignore. Cities such as Kish, Lagash, and Uruk competed for power. Written inscriptions identify rulers. Warfare appears repeatedly in art and texts. Elite burials display extraordinary concentrations of wealth. At the royal cemetery of some graves contained gold, silver, lapis, lazuli, weapons, musical instruments, and luxury objects transported across enormous distances. And on the famous standard of one central figure towers visually above everyone else. That wasn't necessarily bad perspective. Size was politics. Power now had records. Officials, soldiers, ceremonies, symbols, and increasingly, dynasties. The king was no longer simply the strongest person in the village. He was becoming the center of a system. But that leaves the most uncomfortable question of all. Why did everyone else agree to obey him? By now, kings had armies, administrators, wealth, and increasingly permanent positions. But none of that answers the strangest question. Why did everyone else accept it? Archaeology can show us palaces, rich tombs, weapons, and monuments. What it cannot give us is a tablet from 3000 BCE saying, "Here are the reasons we decided this guy should rule us." So there probably wasn't one simple answer. One possibility was warfare. If rival communities threatened your fields, livestock, or water, a leader capable of organizing defense provided something genuinely valuable: survival. But war alone doesn't explain hereditary kings. Another possibility was economic control. If powerful households or institutions controlled grain stores, irrigation systems, valuable land, or trade networks, managing resources could gradually become managing people. Control the surplus. And suddenly, everyone becomes very interested in your opinion. Then there was coordination. Thousands of strangers living together needed roads, irrigation, construction, dispute settlement, food distribution, and defense. Centralized authority could solve real problems. But there was one more ingredient that made power much harder to challenge. Religion. A warrior can tell you, "Obey me because I have soldiers." A sacred ruler can tell you, "Obey me because the gods want me here." That transforms force into something more powerful. Legitimacy. Early kingship may therefore have been neither simply protection nor simply oppression. A ruler could maintain irrigation and demand tribute, protect trade and demand labor, defend the city, then build an enormous monument celebrating himself for defending it. And this reveals the real breakthrough. Humans didn't suddenly invent kings. Instead, several older forms of power began locking together: wealth, war, religion, administration, inheritance. Once one person or one family could combine enough of them, power no longer had to be temporary. So who invented the first king? The surprising answer is probably no one. Kingship wasn't invented like the wheel or pottery. There was no prehistoric genius who suddenly placed a crown on his head and convinced everyone else to kneel. Instead, kings emerged when several older forms of human power began locking together. Imagine 5 separate forces. Wealth. A family controls grain, livestock, land, or valuable trade. Military power. A successful leader commands warriors and protects the settlement. Religious authority. Priests and rituals connect leadership with the supernatural world. Administration. Officials collect resources, organize labor, settle disputes, and keep records. And finally, inheritance. This is where everything changes. A powerful leader eventually dies. Normally, his personal strength dies with him. But what if his son inherits the land? The wealth? The alliances? The soldiers? The rituals? And eventually, the right to rule itself? Now, power doesn't have to start from zero with every generation. It becomes sticky, then permanent, then normal, then traditional, and eventually, sacred. People stop saying, "Everyone listens to him because he's a great warrior." Instead, they begin saying, "His family is supposed to rule." That psychological shift may have been one of the most important moments in political history, because now authority belonged to more than a person. It belonged to a position, and positions could survive the people occupying them. But hereditary power still faced one dangerous question. Why should your family remain above everyone else's forever? Kings needed an answer stronger than soldiers, stronger than wealth, even stronger than tradition. So they turned towards something almost impossible to argue with: the gods. Once kingship became hereditary, rulers faced a dangerous problem. Winning power was one thing. Convincing everyone that your family deserved to keep it forever was something else. Soldiers could force obedience, but no dynasty could survive on spears alone. Eventually, people might start asking, why does his family own the palace? Why do we give him grain? Why are we building his monuments? Ancient rulers needed something stronger than fear. They needed meaning, and religion provided it. In Mesopotamia, rulers increasingly presented themselves as favored by the gods, protected by divine forces, or essential to maintaining cosmic order. The famous Sumerian king list expresses the idea with extraordinary simplicity. Kingship descended from heaven. That's an incredibly powerful political message. The ruler isn't saying, my ancestors became powerful through warfare, wealth, and alliances. He's saying, the universe put us here. Religion transformed political authority into legitimacy. Temples, festivals, offerings, processions, coronations, and public rituals repeatedly placed rulers near the center of sacred life. Then, architecture made that authority physical. Palaces, temples, statues, royal tombs, victory monuments. You didn't merely hear about power. You walked through it. Some rulers pushed this even further. In the 23rd century BCE, the Akkadian ruler Naram-Sin adopted divine status. On his famous victory stele, he towers above defeated enemies, climbing upward while wearing a horned helmet associated with divinity. He is larger, higher, closer to heaven. Ancient propaganda understood camera angles long before cameras existed. But this was the true achievement. Kings weren't merely convincing people that one man was special. They were making the office of kingship itself feel necessary. And once that happened, even the death of a king could no longer kill the throne. And this brings us back to the strange question we started with. Why did that guy get the palace? The army? The taxes? The giant chair? Because eventually, power stopped belonging only to the man sitting on the throne. It belonged to the system around him. Taxes supported administrators. Administrators created records. Records strengthened institutions. Institutions organized armies. Armies protected rulers. Rulers sponsored temples. And temples helped legitimize rulers. A self-reinforcing cycle had appeared. Then something remarkable happened. The king died. But kingship didn't. His palace remained. His officials remained. His laws and rituals could remain. His army remained. And waiting nearby was an heir who had spent his entire life being told that ruling was his birthright. That was the real breakthrough. Humans had transformed personal dominance into an institution capable of surviving the person who dominated. And that idea reached far beyond ancient monarchy. Modern governments are obviously not ancient kingdoms. Yet we still understand a principle our ancestors spent millennia developing. An office can possess authority beyond the individual occupying it. Presidents leave. Judges retire. Generals die. The institution continues. Kingship could organize armies, irrigation, trade, law, diplomacy, and enormous construction projects. It could also justify conquest, inequality, tribute, and forced labor. That contradiction was built into the system. So the next time you see an ancient crown behind museum glass, don't just look at the gold. Look at the idea underneath it. Humans didn't simply invent a powerful man. They invented a story powerful enough to outlive him. Why did that guy get the palace, army, taxes, and throne? Because eventually, people stopped believing in the guy. They started believing in the throne.